Gonzaga has a big man on campus this week. Will the 2025 recruiting class gain another member?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Monday and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode is brought to you by Amazon Fire TV Stick 4K. Turn any TV into an Xbox. No console needed. Just head to amazon.com/Fire TV Locked On to learn more. Well, it's another live edition here of the Locked On Zags podcast live on YouTube. Appreciate those of you joining us here on the show, trying to do these more throughout the off season. We're going to talk about some mailbag questions that we got submitted over the weekend. Some of them submitted a couple weeks ago, as we haven't done a mailbag in a while. We're going to talk about Gonzaga's non-conference schedule, the games already on the schedule, games still to come, who we think they might add to that schedule. We'll also talk about Mark Few's rotation, whether it's impacting recruiting, whether it's impacting their ability to land players either in the transfer portal or out of high school. And we're going to get to all those mailbag questions in the second and third segments. But speaking of high school recruiting, that is where we're going to start the show today. We got an update from Joe Tipton of On3 earlier in the day on Monday that Gonzaga is set to host a 3-star center out of the 2025 recruiting class in Parker Jefferson on an official visit this week. The specific dates of his visit were not given in the post, but it does sound like Jefferson is going to be on campus very soon if he's not already on campus by the time you're listening to this. I will talk about who Jefferson is. He's a 6'10" center. He's originally from Texas, but he's been playing his high school basketball in Inglewood in California. He is currently ranked the 164th prospect in the 2025 recruiting class. That is according to 24/7 Sports' composite rankings, which takes the average between 24/7 Sports, ESPN, On3, Rivals, all of them collected together, averaged out. He comes out to being just on the outside of being a top 150 prospect in this 2025 class. He's a 25th ranked player among centers and the 19th ranked player in the state of California. Jefferson, one of the best uncommitted players still available in the 2025 class. And the reason he is uncommitted is because back in November of 2024, he did make a commitment to the University of Minnesota to join the Golden Gophers in the Big Ten Conference. But after Minnesota's coaching change at the end of the season, they let go of Ben Johnson and brought in Colorado State head coach Nico Medved. Jefferson decided to reopen his recruitment, had to get rid of his NLI, go through the whole thing. He was locked in at Minnesota, decided, nope, I'd like to keep my options open once again. When he initially committed to Minnesota back in November, he had offers from USC. He had an offer from Iowa, Central Florida, St. Louis, Oral Roberts. There was a few other ones on there as well, but those were kind of the main schools that stood out who'd offered him kind of initially out of high school. And then now we haven't seen a list or anything specific for Jefferson of other programs who are showing interest in him right now, other than the fact that he's coming to campus for Mark Few and the Gonzaga Bulldogs. More about him, some scouting reports. The most up-to-date, full-length scouting report that I could find was a couple years old, so it's probably a little bit kind of take some of that with a grain of salt, as it turns out. Even college kids change a lot in 2 years. High school kids change a whole bunch between 2022 and 2025 now. It's probably going to be a much different report. But from everything we've pieced together, from watching some highlight clips of him on his social media accounts, reading the latest updated stuff, things people are saying, he's been lauded for his high basketball IQ. He's a very good passer. I think that's probably one of the more appealing traits for Mark Few and the Zags at his size. Listed at 6'10", not a super big 6'10", but not, he's not built like Chet Holmgren either. He's got a little bit of size on him, and he's a very, very good passer. He's got really soft hands, can handle passes in a lot of different ways, can handle entry passes in transition. Again, you watch the clips of him, some of the passes that he snatches out of the air. It's very impressive, and a huge critical kind of aspect of being a big in Gonzaga system. And again, for any of you watching or listening to the show, you know that if you're a Gonzaga big who struggles to handle passes, I mean, we've seen turnovers plenty for players who get, maybe a goofy bounce pass or Ryan Nembhard whipping them a ball that nobody's expecting, and they're not able to handle it. So having those soft hands and those ability to corral some of those passes, I think, is a key element of being a high usage big in Gonzaga's system. And he also has the ability to extend his shot out to the 3-point range. And I think that's a huge critical element for Gonzaga as well, in terms of wanting a big who can be more versatile than just down at the basket, scoring around the rim, not being able to do a whole lot else. Gonzaga has those guys. They've had those guys for decades. And when there's nothing wrong with being that player, but if you want to ensure yourself the ability to get playing time at Gonzaga, have that versatility to also stretch out and shoot the 3 ball. And again, Braden Huff's a perfect example of a player who's incredibly elite at scoring around the rim. And he didn't shoot it well last year from 3, but he shot it better his first year. And frankly, he looks like a capable outside shooter. And I think that going into this year, Gonzaga confidence starting him at the 4 as opposed to having him be the backup 5 is in part to keep both Graham Ike and Braden Huff, but also the confidence in like, hey, we think he can space the floor a little bit. And again, so for somebody like Jefferson to be able to do that, I think is huge in terms of his ability to gain playing time in Gonzaga's system were he to come to campus. In terms of his words, this is from an article when he committed to Minnesota in the first place, asked about his game specifically from Joe Tipton. He said, quote, "I'm a very versatile big who can stretch the floor, push it in transition, and my passing is one of my best qualities. I'm just a competitor who wants to win." Being willing to get out in transition, of course, critical for Gonzaga as well. How many times did Braden Huff or Graham Ike beat everybody down the floor and score at the rim last year? I mean, that was something, the amount of times you just saw a deflating play for the other team where they finally got a bucket and they were celebrating and they were happy. And before they could even finish being happy about scoring a bucket, Graham Ike or Braden Huff's finishing on the other side. And so a player who's willing to run the floor at 6'10" is definitely going to be a welcome sight for those of us in Spokane. So in terms of the fit at Gonzaga, we've already kind of highlighted a few of the things, but one kind of area where I'm interested is Jefferson's listed as a center. He's listed as a center at 247. He's listed as a center at on 3. He's ranked compared to other centers in his class. However, Gonzaga has 3 centers on the roster, and we know Braden Huff's going to play the 4. And so in theory, I should stop calling him a center because he is going to be the power forward next year. But stylistically in this offense, he has always played the 5. And the 5 in Gonzaga's offense is back to the basket, constantly posting up, looking for advantages, on the block. And the 4 is playing away from the rim. They're doing more dribble handoffs. They're doing more of the high-low entry passes. They're expected more to put the ball on the deck at times. And so for Gonzaga, with Graham Ike is a 5. Braden Huff is going to have to play more of the 4 role for this offense, but he's best suited as a 5. Ismail Adiani is very clearly a 5. So I kind of think there's a chance that Parker Jefferson is viewed more as a 4, particularly with the scouting report being for a player who can shoot the ball, who's got range out to the 3-point line, and who has a high basketball IQ and likes to pass the ball. That role fits. He could, again, it would look kind of similar to what Ben Gregg's role was the last couple of years, where you're at the top of the key, you're swinging the ball around, you're looking to make entry passes down low to Graham or Braden, you do the dribble handoffs, all those kind of different elements that Ben exceeded at and that, frankly, Michael Ajayi struggled with, which was part of the reason his role changed as the year went on. Gonzaga needs somebody to fill that role because Braden Huff can do it. He's capable of doing it, but it's not really it's not him doing what he's best at. And so I think if you have somebody who can fill that role, and I think ultimately the overall conclusion for Parker Jefferson, were he to commit to Gonzaga, is he probably not going to play a ton in his first year. He's going to be the 4th big. Whether he's the lone power forward on the roster, whether he's backing up Braden Huff at that position, he's going to be the 4th big. I think he would be behind Graham, Braden, and Diani in terms of minutes. 4th bigs at Gonzaga are rarely members of the actual rotation. So I think he would be somebody who's kind of on the outskirts of playing time for Gonzaga this season. But what a better place to learn for a big who fancies himself as a transition passer, as a 3-point shooter, a floor spacer who likes to score in a variety of different ways. Come to Gonzaga and learn from Graham Ike, learn from Braden Huff, learn from Ismail Adiani. The Gonzaga's development system in terms of bigs is incredible. They don't miss. I mean, they really don't, especially domestic bigs. I mean, look at the recent success of recruiting players from the United States out of high school. Drew Timme and Braden Huff are two of the most recent ones. Those guys far exceeded their expectations. Drew Timme was not a top 50 prospect in his recruiting class. Braden Huff, it took him until like the last few months for him to even climb into the top 100. And both those guys were outstanding, especially compared to where they were ranked out of high school. So I don't pay any attention to the fact that Parker Jefferson is not a top 150 player. Like the skill sets that he possessed from the videos we've watched, from the scouting reports that we've read, is tailor-made for Gonzaga system. And if he were to choose to come to Gonzaga and start his career here and work his tail off as a freshman to earn more playing time as a sophomore, he could absolutely be kind of the next Braden Huff, the next player who kind of fills that role as a valuable offensive weapon for this team. And obviously Ismaila Diani is going to fill a big role as well, but these two players seem like they would very much complement each other, in Diani being more of a rim protector and more of a low back to the basket scorer, whereas Jefferson, it sounds like, can stretch it out a little bit, is more of a passer, is a bit more able to kind of get up and down the floor. Like, I think there's these two players, if you wanted them to kind of be the future front court for the Gonzaga Bulldogs, I think it could work great. And I'd be really interested to see if he does end up trying to come to Gonzaga, because they're obviously invested. They're bringing him onto campus for a reason. So there's a lot of interest and excitement about what he's able to bring. And I think that based on Gonzaga's track record, it's hard to find a better place that somebody with this particular set of skills could go and develop. I don't think there's a better place than Gonzaga, and I hope that he recognizes that and ends up committing to Spokane. Well, we're going to move on to the mailbag portion of the show. It is Monday after all. So what does Gonzaga's non-conference schedule look like at this point next year? Who else might be added to the schedule? We're going to talk about that and more for Mailbag coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, the NBA playoffs are here, and FanDuel is giving new customers an incredible way to get in on the action. Right now, when you join FanDuel and place your first $5 bet, you'll get $250 in bonus bets if you win. And I love how FanDuel makes betting super easy. Whether it's picking my favorite team or diving into player prop, from three-pointers to steals to assists, FanDuel has so many ways to bet your favorite player props. Plus, after the game tips off, you can even combine your live prop bets into a same-game parlay for a chance to win big. And Gonzaga right now still at plus 3,500 odds to take home the national title in 2026. If you're feeling spicy, want to toss some money down on that, don't miss out. Head to FanDuel.com to claim your $250 in bonus bets today. Today's episode is also brought to you by Varsity Icons. Folks, get ready to bring your favorite Zags to life with VarsityIcons.com, who deliver the ultimate collection of action figures that honors both current and former Zags. Varsity Icons is the premier sports collectible figure for your Gonzaga Bulldogs. And today we're highlighting everybody's fan favorite, Ben Gregg. Varsity Icons was started by a longtime Gonzaga Bulldogs fan who wanted to create collectible figures of everybody's all-time favorite Zags. The mission of Varsity Icons is to create figures of current and former Zags for everybody to collect and enjoy. And there's no question that Varsity Icons wanted to highlight Ben Gregg to be their first player. He has been a fan favorite since joining the Zags way back in 2021. Ben exemplified what it meant to be a Gonzaga Bulldog every time he stepped on the court. So order your Varsity Icons Ben Gregg figure today at VarsityIcons.com. Varsity Icons, where icons live forever. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. Moving away from talking about recruit Parker Jefferson, who Gonzaga is bringing onto campus this week to potentially add to Davis Fogel in the 2025 recruiting class, to answer some mailbag questions. Some of these were submitted a couple weeks ago. Some of these were submitted much more recently than that, kind of collected all the ones that still were relevant to talk about and threw them here together. So I apologize for not doing mailbag as often. It's probably going to be more of a monthly thing here. I'll try to reach out and let people know when we're going to do these mailbags as much as I can. But with transfer portal and everything that's going on, sometimes we just got a lot of other stuff to get to. But got 6 questions to get to today to close out the show, 3 here in this segment. The first one here from Jeff via Gmail. Jeff says, who do you think Gonzaga might schedule in their remaining games in 2025-26? Would love to see some future Pac-12 teams other than Washington State and Oregon State, but there's not much room for them to be scheduled. And then AD Simone 206 on Discord also said, who is on your non-conference schedule wish list for 2025-26? All right, let's talk about non-conference scheduling. It's that time in the off season. One of those times we'll probably talk about non-conference scheduling multiple times between now and the start of the season. But here's what we know so far. Gonzaga set to participate in the Players Era NIL Festival, which was the new MTE event, MTE that took place in Las Vegas last year. I know Houston was in it, Creighton was in it, Oregon, San Diego State, lots of great teams. This year, it's even bigger. There's a ton of elite programs in this event. So Gonzaga is going to get some big games in Las Vegas over Feast Week this year. 3 games in that. They're going to have a road game against Arizona State as a return for the home and home series that started last year. They're going to play Kentucky in Nashville on December 5th. They're going to play UCLA in Seattle. They're going to play Baylor as well. Those are the games that we know. And that's a pretty good group of teams already on the schedule for Gonzaga because, again, they're going to get some really marquee opponents in the Players Era Festival. And then Kentucky and UCLA and Baylor are all expected to be good. Not as confident about Arizona State, but it's certainly not the worst team that Gonzaga could have on the schedule, especially as a true road game. Just by virtue of being in the Big 12, that probably will end up being a quad 1 game for Gonzaga. Knock on wood. We'll see what happens with the Sun Devils this year. In terms of some teams I'd like to see added, curious if UW will kind of restructure their schedule. Obviously, as when Danny Sprinkle took over as the head coach at the University of Washington, he's canceled the game that they were going to play that year. I'm curious if they'll try to re-up that. In theory, they owe Gonzaga a game in Spokane at the Kennel. So I'll see if Danny Sprinkle and UW wants to play that game. That's certainly always a fun one to have on the schedule. And I like the offseason moves that UW has made. And I think Danny Sprinkle's a good coach. And I think that could be a pretty quality team that Gonzaga could put on the schedule. Some other ones, I don't think we'll see San Diego State. We already had the 2-year series with them. I don't think they'd schedule one game before the Pac-12 season next year. And I think that's kind of the trick with scheduling some of these Pac-12 teams is usually when you do a scheduling agreement, it's at least 2 years, a home and a home or a pseudo home and a home, where it'd be like Gonzaga playing in Seattle and then they'd play somebody else in like LA or whatever. But because there's only 1 year before these teams are in the same conference, that doesn't mean you could see like a one-off neutral site game. I could see everybody's favorite, right? The Samford Pentagon in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. That's a good middle ground between like Gonzaga and say Colorado State. Like something like that, I guess could happen. I want to say it won't happen, but I would be pretty surprised if the remaining games in Gonzaga's non-conference schedule, if any of them end up being future Pac-12 opponents. I don't think that that's particularly likely to happen. In terms of teams that I would like to see, I already mentioned UW. I'd love to see Utah State or Colorado State again. I don't think it's likely, but I'd like to see them. If we're talking bigger name teams, I'd love to see Memphis. Certainly not a future Pac-12 opponent yet, but there is lots of conversation about Memphis joining the Pac-12. It's kind of died down a bit, but hey, you never know. Maybe that'll end up happening. And I always love playing those Big East schools. If we're not going to do UConn, we're not going to re-up that series. Let's go try to get something with Greg McDermott and Creighton. Let's go try to get something with Shaka Smart and Marquette. Even somebody like Georgetown, who's kind of been on the up and up, Villanova with their new coach coming in, and Kevin Willard. Like, there's some fun teams that they could play out there. I love the Big East. I love playing those Big East schools, so I think that'd be a lot of fun. I also wouldn't hate re-upping with John Calipari. We played them when he coached in Memphis. We played them when they coached at Kentucky. Let's play him when now he's coaching at Arkansas and get a game against the Hogs. I think that'd be a fun one as well. Next question here comes from BD Brownie on Discord, who says, what takeaways do you think Mark Few and the staff could use to guide their decisions on roster construction and offensive/defensive systems going forward? This isn't to say the recent teams have been failures, far from it, but looking at how they can get back to being 1 seed title major contenders again. I don't think it has a lot to do with the offensive or defensive systems. It does have a little bit to do with roster construction, but more so it has to do with adding super high-end talent, which is just a lot more difficult to do in an era where high-end talent is commanding millions upon millions of dollars. It's not to say Gonzaga does not have millions upon millions of dollars. If they didn't have that amount of money, they wouldn't have Graham Ike and Braden Huff both still on the roster. I can promise you that. But Gonzaga's best, most successful teams, the teams that have been 1 seeds, the teams that have gone to the national championship, have had 5-star one-and-done talent on the roster. I know Zach Collins was not a huge part of Gonzaga's 2016-17 team, but he was a critical piece to that roster. And then, of course, the 21 team had Jalen Suggs. They also had NBA players in Corey Kispert and Andrew Nembhard. They had Drew Timme on that roster. Anton Watson was on that roster. So tons of talent on those teams. And that's not to say that, again, the last 2 years weren't lacking talent, but We're not going to be doing a lot of talk about the NBA draft on the podcast this year because there's not going to be any players from Gonzaga drafted into the NBA this year. And that's a difference from their previous teams that have been in that championship conversation, that have been one seeds, like, the year after 21 when they were a one seed, even though they lost early that year because they had Chet Holmgren. Like, that's how you get into that conversation. Gonzaga's offensive system is elite. It is top notch. It is nearly unbeatable. They can churn out top 5, top 10 offenses in the country, even if their talent is not at that top 5 level. So I don't think there's any concern about the offense. I'm also not really concerned about roster construction. We're going to talk about that in the next question, so I won't get into it too much here. I think really the issue is just how can we figure out how to land the highest caliber talent? And does that require us to raise more money? Does that what does that look like from our perspective in order to get that talent? Or how do we find kind of ways to add talent that maybe is not being viewed as they're not commanding as much money as maybe we think they're worth? Something like Parker Jefferson. Is he the difference between being a one seed? Not necessarily, but maybe you can find some kind of diamonds in the rough, some hidden gem type players, and turn that into a way to get back into that one seed conversation. But I don't think it has much to do with like the systems that Mark Few runs, as much as just it's harder to get high-end talent now than it used to be. And until there's more guardrails in college basketball, that's going to continue to be the case. Next question comes from Ted Z on Discord, who says, how much do Mark Few's rotations and systems impact recruiting? A lot of people blame NIL, but I think uncertainty in role and minutes is a big factor when guys end up committing elsewhere. I mean, yeah, but I guess I don't really understand what the issue with that is. Like, I don't think that other programs are promising guys playing time and Mark Few's, like, if Mark Few's saying you got to compete for your role and a player says, I don't want to compete for my role, I want to go somewhere where I'm guaranteed a starting spot, I don't think that's a Gonzaga issue. Like, I think that's a player issue. And I think that is and again, that may be the case. Like if somebody like, Trace and Eagle's staff, and I don't know what happened in any conversations with him, I'm just using him as an example. He's probably more likely to be guaranteed playing time at South Carolina than he was at Gonzaga. And then he decided not to go to South Carolina, and then he went to West Virginia. And it's like, yeah, probably a similar case there. I think Trace and Eagle's staff would have started and played huge minutes for Gonzaga, but I doubt Mark Few guaranteed that. And so maybe that's where some of that breakdown happens. But here's the thing. Gonzaga plays a tight 8-9-ish man rotation. They always have, but they're not alone in that. In fact, looking at last year's roster and their percentage of minutes that were played by players coming off the bench, teams that finished below them that had that played their starters a heavier amount of time than Gonzaga include Florida, Houston, Duke, Tennessee, Texas Tech, Iowa State, Purdue, Marquette, St. John's. Need I go on and on? Gonzaga is always towards the bottom in terms of playing their bench. They always have been. They're usually in like the 300s in terms of the 360 teams, but Kansas is almost always below them. North Carolina is almost always below them. Like most of the best teams in college basketball don't allocate a ton of minutes to guys coming off the bench. And I just don't think that if players are not committing to Gonzaga because they don't know what their role is going to be, I have a hard time blaming that on the coaching staff unless the messaging is really bad. But I don't think the messaging is all that bad. I think that it's more NIL than anything else. Like, I don't think it's exclusively NIL. I think ultimately, and this is maybe a larger conversation for another time, but I think ultimately it's just that Gonzaga's picky. Like, I think that it comes down to that more than anything else. Like, Mark Few, like they're getting priced out of certain guys for sure, but it's less of like we're completely broke. It's more of like, I don't want to spend this much money on said player, and he's asking for this much money, but an SEC school is going to pay him that, so we're just going to let him go over there. And you could, like, to some extent, that's just them not having enough money, but I also think it's them not being willing to spend that amount of money. They prioritize retaining talent. They prioritize making sure that Graham Ike and Braden Huff stayed in Spokane, and if that cost them a chance to land guys who are getting $1 million, who probably weren't necessarily worth $1 million, then yeah, I think that's what Gonzaga is going to continue to do. So I don't think it has as much to do with like role uncertainty as much as it has to do with Gonzaga being picky and players just choosing to capitalize financially as best they can. We got some more mailbag questions to close out the show, including some former Zag talk, a look at Drew Timmy's future, and more. All of that coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, there is nothing like the atmosphere of an NBA playoff game. Every bucket, every defensive stop, every moment feels huge, and it is completely electric in those arenas. And with Game Time, you can now be a part of it without all of the stress of last-minute ticket hunting. Game Time makes it fast and easy to get playoff tickets, even when the demand is sky high. Prices on the app actually go down as tip-off gets closer. And here's why I use Game Time. You can save up to 60% off by buying last-minute tickets, not just for sporting events, but for concerts, comedy shows, and theater as well. The all-in pricing also means no surprise fees at checkout. What you see is what you pay. Julian Strother and the Denver Nuggets are hosting the Los Angeles Clippers in Game 5 of their series on Tuesday. Tickets right now, you can get in the door for just $98 using Game Time. So folks, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms apply. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, folks, segment 3, still any patents, still Locked On Zags podcast. Closing out the show with a couple more mailbag questions before getting you on with the rest of your Monday evening. Next question comes from Austin Simpson via Discord, who says, with a few holes left to fill in the roster, what former Gonzaga players would you use to fill those holes? All right, very vague question. So we're going to just kind of take it the way that we want to take it. I'm assuming this is not former Gonzaga players who are like still available currently in the transfer portal, and which is far more limiting for us. It's basically Dom Harris, Colby Brooks. I think those are the only two who are currently available. Efton Reed, if he gets another year. But if we're just talking like anybody in Gonzaga history to throw onto this roster, I think the holes that Gonzaga has on this roster in terms of gaps right now that will be in the rotation next year is basically just a shooting guard, like somebody to play between Braden Smith and Jalen Warley on the guard position, the kind of the Nolan Hickman / Caleb Battle replacement. I think Gonzaga will also pursue a backup point guard. They may even pursue a backup power forward, but looking at the players who I expect to be in Gonzaga's rotation next year, we already have like 6 or 7 of those spots filled, depending on Steel Ventures' health. So there's not a ton of room, but I'm going to give you 3 names. And I'm giving you names based on players that I think would actually fill those roles. It'd be easy to say, yeah, give me Jalen Suggs, Kevin Pangos, and Rui Hachimura. Like, sure, that would be awesome, but they don't really fill the specific roles. So if we're looking for a starting shooting guard, I think you're looking for somebody who's a bit bigger. The Ryan Nembhard, Nolan Hickman, 6 foot, 6'2" backcourt was not super successful defensively. So you want a bigger guard who's got some length, who can space the floor. I think those are critical things for Gonzaga. So if I was picking a former player to put in that spot, give me Stephen Gray. Stephen Gray was incredible in his 4-year career at Gonzaga. He was a 37% three-point shooter. He had defensive versatility. He also was somebody who'd been a role player and who'd also been the guy. He kind of did both those things during his time in Spokane. So I think he'd be a great player to kind of fit into this mix of Gonzaga players right now. And then if you're looking for a backup point guard, I kind of hummed and hawed about this. There's a couple backup point guards I really liked, but I ended up going with Aaron Cook. Aaron Cook only spent 1 year at Gonzaga. He started at Southern Illinois, spent some time at Georgia as well. But in his 1 year at Gonzaga, he shot 35% from 3. He averaged over 5 assists per 40 minutes. I think he'd be a great backup pass first point guard who could space the floor a little bit as well. And then for the depth power forward option, this was kind of a fun one. I ended up going with Drew Barham. Drew Barham spent 2 years at Memphis before transferring and spending 2 years at Gonzaga. He's a little undersized, like 6'6", 6'7", but he shot 47% from 3 combined in his 2 seasons at Gonzaga. If you added a 6'7" floor spacing backup power forward onto this roster, I mean, that's kind of what Steel Venters is, except that he's not a power forward necessarily. But I just think that would give Gonzaga more options off the bench, more floor spacing, give more room for Graham Ike and Braden Huff to operate down on the block. So a lineup, something like Braden Smith, Stephen Gray, Jalen Warley, Huff, and Ike in the starting 5, and then Cook, Venters, Innocente, Barham, Diani, Fogel coming off the bench. That's 6 through 11. Obviously, you got a couple guys who aren't going to be in that rotation, but I think that gives you a really quality team. And so those are the types of players that I'd like to see Gonzaga be pursuing if they could find somebody in that archetype for those spots. Next question comes from Jackie Daytona via Discord, who says, what do you think is a realistic path forward for Drew Timme, considering he's not the 3-and-D type player that the NBA is coveting these days? Yeah, I think Drew did enough in his final, the 12 games that he played in the NBA this season. I think he did enough to kind of keep himself as a backup NBA big. For starters, Brooklyn signed him to a contract, so he's under contract going into next season. That doesn't mean he won't get cut, but it's a lot easier to make the NBA when you're already on a contract than when you're fighting to get a contract. So that's a huge positive step for Drew in terms of sticking on an NBA roster next year. And even if Brooklyn cuts him, the fact that Brooklyn signed him and played him, and he played well in the games that he played, and also was just like, once you've gotten that to that point, getting another contract, getting a team to be willing to actually give you an NBA contract and NBA guarantees is much, much easier. So I think what we saw from Drew in the last month of the regular season was enough for him to continue having an NBA career, which is tremendous. It's an incredible news for Drew, for his family, for his friends, for everybody. I don't see Drew having I don't see his playing time dramatically increasing as his career goes on because he's still so limited defensively. And the 3-point shooting, he's good enough now that he can shoot from beyond the arc, but he's still not knocking him down at such a high clip that he's commanding a bunch of attention defensively. I don't think he's much more than a rotation big. I think he's kind of a fringe rotation guy. Like there'll be he might play a lot at the end of seasons on tanking teams like he did last year with Brooklyn. They were tanking. They didn't care if they won or lost. And so Drew got a lot of run and got a lot of playing time for him. I think that could continue to happen for him, but on playoff teams or on teams that are trying to win early in the year, I'd be surprised if he's getting much more than just a handful of minutes per game as kind of a stopgap third string type center. I don't see him ever being a 20, 25, 30 minute per game guy in the NBA, which is unfortunate because the offensive, I think if he were getting 25 minutes a night, I think he could score really well in the NBA, but the defense is just such a limiting factor for him, unfortunately. Final question of the show comes from Jeff via Gmail. Jeff says, what do you think Gonzaga baseball needs to do to get over the hump? Is baseball similar to Gonzaga women's basketball in the fact that their postseason hopes will likely come down to 4 days in the WCC tournament in Las Vegas? Yeah, losing 2 out of 3 this weekend to San Diego was a killer for the Zags. That cost them first place in the conference going into the WCC tournament, which is real brutal for them. I do think their postseason hopes probably come down to winning the WCC tournament in order to get a regional bid. We've seen some of the projections that have come out that had Gonzaga in the field and also had San Diego in the field. So it's possible 2 teams come out of the WCC. But yeah, I think it's a situation where Gonzaga's probably got to take care of business in that tournament in Las Vegas in order to make sure that they're in a regional. But what a year. What a year for the Zags coming off of a really disappointing season last year. They had 2 great years in a row, then just completely tanked last year after losing a lot of talent. And then this year kind of rebuilt, had a streak where they went, I think, 16 out of 18 for a while, did really well in the conference, struggled in the non-conference, but a lot of their non-conference opponents were teams like USC and Oregon State and other really quality programs. So, challenging themselves by playing a tough non-con doesn't hurt either. So excited to see what the future looks like for this Gonzaga baseball program. That's going to wrap it up for me today, folks. Thanks again for making this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Thanks to those of you hanging out with me live as well. Always appreciate having you in the house while we record this show. We'll be back live again on Tuesday at 3 p.m. all day or all week, 3 p.m. Pacific time, live on YouTube. Come check it out. If you're listening on the audio platforms and you want to do it, just go to YouTube, search Locked On Zags, hit that subscribe button. It is very much appreciated. Thanks again, folks, for listening. Have a fantastic rest of your day. And as always, go Zags.